Though Celtic law stated that Boudica was the ruler of the land of Iceni, when her husband died, the Romans couldn't care less. They had her and her daughters viciously assaulted before taking everything from her title, her land, and her wealth. But the Romans seriously underestimated this formidable warrior queen, and they would come to rue the day that they crossed her. When the Roman Empire took her lands and harmed her daughters, the fearless Queen Boudica was not about to let them get away with it. The Celtic warrior led a historic upspring against the Romans in 60 AD, causing catastrophic damage to multiple towns and even burning London to the ground. However, her reign of fury didn't last long. By 61 AD, the Iron Age's ultimate fighter met a perilous end. Boudica is an ancient Celtic name which is derived from the word baud, meaning victory, and even though she's one of the most legendary women in history, we don't know too much about Boudica's early days. Scholars think she was born around 30 AD in what is now Colchester. Here's what we know for sure, though. Young Boudica was fancy from day one. She either belonged to a prominent family or had royal blood, and soon she'd level up even more. Celtic societies were actually cool with women holding power. Ladies could rule, participate in politics, make art, choose who they married, and even get divorced. If a foolish husband was dumb enough to harm his bride, by law she could poison the jerk or even cut his head off. Another thing that helped Boudica dominate her foes? Her ferocious looks. She was a statuesque tall woman with a piercing gaze and a deep, commanding voice. Of all Boudica's physical traits, one is particularly unforgettable. Her incredible hair, with her long, thick, vibrant red hair, Boudica looked like a toughened-up version of Merida from Brave. Some sources even say the Boudica's fiery locks went all the way down to her royal waist. In other words, she was a total catch, and soon enough, all the eligible gentlemen came calling. With her high-class background and her smoking-hot looks, Boudica was always going to make a good match. When she was 18 years old, Boudica married the king of the Iceni tribe, the handsome and powerful Prosatagus. The royal couple soon welcomed 2 daughters, but sadly, their happy days wouldn't last long. Around 43 AD, the Roman Emperor Claudius started to conquer Britain with an iron fist. The Iceni people, who until this point had been left alone, quickly saw the writing on the wall. They knew it would only be a matter of time before the Romans invaded their lands. Boudica and her husband had to figure out how to handle their threat, and fast. At first, Boudica and the king decided to play nice with the Romans. They struck a deal. If the Romans let them continue to live the way they liked, the Iceni wouldn't make trouble for Britain's new invaders. For a time, this agreement worked just fine. But after just a few years, everything fell apart in a spectacular fashion. Emperor Nero has a reputation for being a real tool, and his role in Boudica's story doesn't exactly make people see him any differently. When calm Emperor Claudius kicked the bucket and Nero took over the Roman self-relations, things got real messy, real fast. Under Nero's rule, the Romans went from awkward but mostly harmless invaders to actively aggressive enemies. It didn't take long for the Iceni to reach their breaking point. Under Nero's rule, a control freak of a Roman governor named Osterius Scapula rose to power. In 47 AD, he got the bright idea to forbid the Iceni from carrying weapons unless they were hunting or traveling. Understandably, the Iceni weren't on board with being vulnerable while they were literally surrounded by foreign enemies. That same year, they lashed out with a violent rebellion. The Iceni revolt saw Boudica's people rise up and fight against their oppressors, the Romans. It sounds thrilling, and for a brief time, I'm sure it was. But soon enough, the Romans shut down the whole thing. In some versions of Boudica's story, even after defeating the Iceni, the Romans had even more humiliation in store for the royal couple. According to some sources, this is the moment when Boudica's husband became a client king. Evidently, they didn't like that his people had tried to revolt, so they punished the Iceni king with a huge demotion. While he had some independence as king, Rome fully expected to take over completely when Prasutagus passed. Little did they know, that day was just around the corner. In 60 AD, King Prasutagus breathed his last, and man oh man, with him gone, all hell broke loose. You see, when the king passed, he and Boudica had 2 daughters, but no sons. The Celts wouldn't have minded, but the Romans, they had a big problem with powerful women. Desperate, the king attempted to outsmart the Romans with a finicky clause in his will. Let's see how that works out, shall we? Boudica's hubby attempted to play politics and win protection for his family. He cleverly willed half of his wealth to his daughters, and in a pristine example of historical sucking up, gave the other half to Emperor Nero. Unfortunately, this backfired in a major way. The Romans decided they didn't want half of the king's money. They wanted it all. As Boudica and her daughters grieved, the Romans used the Iceni king's demise as an excuse to take over the tribal lands and show the Iceni who was boss. According to one source, the Romans' chilling instructions were to bring the territory to its knees. The Romans immediately began their brutal spree, kicking off the shebang by running through Boudica's home and looting all her valuable items. And that was just the beginning. The Romans continued to run wild through the Iceni lands. They targeted the tribe's most prominent noblemen, publicly declaring that they no longer held any power. As for the less fortunate, one source says the Romans forced them into slavery, but they saved their worst punishments for Boudica and her daughters. Though Celtic laws stated that Boudica would rule the Iceni when her husband passed, the Romans couldn't care less. After helping themselves to her most prized possessions, the Romans ended their tour by shoving the queen out of her home, ripping off her clothing, tying her to a pole, and viciously whipping her in front of her subjects. Boudica suffered an unimaginable painful fate. After all, the Romans were known for their next-level punishments. They added stones to the ends of their whips so that the victim would be hurt even more. Oh, and unfortunately for Boudica, that's not all. The Romans didn't believe in the less is more school of thought. While other ancient societies would call it a day after 40 lashes, the Romans were happy to up that number to 100. As a sign of their brutality, Romans often whipped their victims right before ending their life. That's how intense this public punishment would have been, and the Romans weren't even done. Boudica's public humiliation went way beyond the pale. You see, to the Iceni people, Boudica wasn't just a queen. According to one source, her people also thought of her as a high priestess, or even the living incarnation of the goddess Andresta. Because of this, the Romans' actions weren't just cruel, they were sacrilege. Even after Boudica's whipping, the Romans weren't done with the royal family. In their absolute worst act, the men took Boudica's daughters and violated them. One source estimates that the 2 young girls, whose names are unknown to this day, were just 8 and 10 years old at the time of the Romans' merciless attacks. Despite their heinous treatment, Boudica's daughters could have had it a lot worse. Back in Rome, if a nobleman's daughter stepped out of line, they could be thrown off a cliff, among other things. The way the Romans treated Boudica was completely shudder-inducing, but it hurt Boudica more than it would have harmed someone else. After all, Queen Boudica and her deceased husband had, for the most part, played by the Romans' rules. To avoid them, they were allies, not enemies, which must have made the Romans' cold-blooded betrayal even worse. So why did the Romans go all scorched earth on the relationship with Boudica and the Iceni? Let's call a spade a spade. It was, in part, because of good old sexism. The Celts were down with the idea of a lady in power, while the Romans were not. The Romans also played dirty. During Boudica's husband's reign, the Romans gave the Iceni some free money in the form of grant. But then a procurator conveniently decided that actually the grant was more of a loan. They used this handy re-rating of history as an excuse to steal from the Iceni nobles. The Romans had another far more relatable reason. It was simple. Location, location, location. The Roman Empire bordered the west, with waters surrounding the north and east, and everything else covered in thick forest. To the Romans' joy, this made invasion nearly impossible. There was just one problem with this plan. The Romans didn't have to worry about invaders. Just like in a horror movie, the call was coming from inside the house. Boudica began plotting her revenge. Boudica didn't waste any time planning her revolution. It just so happened that the Iceni weren't the only tribe who had beef with the Romans. Boudica could rile up a crowd like no one else. By the time she was done traveling around the neighboring tribes, the Fearless had managed to raise an astonishing 100,000 men to join the fight. With her allies secured, there was just one thing left to do: kick some Roman butt. Before leading her forces into battle, Boudica reportedly gave a rousing speech worthy of Braveheart. She assembled her fighters and declared, "I'm not fighting for my kingdom and wealth. I'm fighting as an ordinary person for my lost freedom. Consider how many of you are fighting and why. Then you will win this battle, or perish." She finished off her speech with this incredible line: "This is what I, a woman, plan to do. Let the men live in slavery if they will. Tell them, Boudica." And so, with Boudica's own version of the Avengers assembled, she set her sights on the ultimate target, the settlement of Camillodunum. This was no ordinary city. Camillodunum was the capital of Roman Britain. By attacking Camillodunum, Boudica was sending a message. She was coming for the Romans, and she was not going to back down. When Boudica and her squad arrived, they knew exactly what to destroy first. They immediately headed to the Temple of Claudius, an expensive building that honored Emperor Claudius's domination of the British kings. As a sign of how much they hated the Romans, Boudica ordered her men to burn the entire building down. Boudica wasn't content with just destroying a building. When she found a bronze statue of Claudius, she knew that mere destruction wouldn't do. Instead of smashing the statue into smithereens, Boudica used it to send a chilling message. She ordered her men to cut the head off the statue. Message received: "This lady is out for blood." Boudica triumphed at Camillodunum partially because she was angry as heck, but also because the Romans messed up. They didn't defend the city adequately, and Boudica certainly took advantage of their failure. Within just 2 days, Boudica burned the city down and slaughtered thousands of Romans. If they didn't perish in the fray, they burned alive. To this day, Boudica's attack goes down by an appropriately terrifying name. It's called the Massacre of the 9th Legion. No one's saying Boudica wasn't right to be angry at the Romans, but at the same time, we have to admit that she kind of went overboard. Boudica didn't differentiate between good Romans and bad Romans. She just destroyed whoever was in her way, including lots and lots of innocent bystanders. And that's not all. According to ancient sources who wrote about Boudica's raids, our girl went really hard on the whole vengeance thing. Her preferred execution method involved detaching her enemies' heads from their bodies. Boudica would then hold up the bloody head and declare that it was a sacrifice to her favorite goddess, Andrasta. Boudica's raid was so extreme that the rivers were, and I quote, purpled with blood. After her victory, Boudica continued her destructive spree. She traveled to the city of Londinium, unsurprisingly what is now modern-day London, and took her bloodlust to a whole nother level. An ancient account says that Boudica hung up the noble woman like animals. When she was done with this crude scene, she supposedly skewered them like meat on a stick. Fire and gross boob-related executions weren't the only ways Boudica tried to triumph over the Romans. One of Boudica's strategies was to take what she thought were abandoned Roman food stores and use them for her own men. However, for once, this plan did not go well. The Roman general Suetonius anticipated Boudica's move and burned down his own storehouses just so that Boudica's army would starve. Despite this minor setback, Boudica was unstoppable. After conquering Londinium, Boudica traveled to Verulamium and continued her fiery road trip. Boudica's troops triumphed yet again, but this victory had a dark side. Altogether, Boudica and her forces ended the lives of about 70,000 to 80,000 Romans. And these weren't just soldiers. This number included a staggering amount of innocent civilians. After destroying 3 of the Romans' most prized settlements, Boudica and her forces felt unstoppable. In 61 AD, the warrior queen prepared for one final decisive confrontation. If she won this battle, she would finally defeat the Romans and bring Britain back under Celtic control. In other words, this was the big one. So it's a shame that, after all Boudica's blood, sweat, and tears, it devolved into a horrific disaster. To this day, historians aren't completely sure of where Boudica's final standoff against the Romans took place. The event is called the Battle of Watling Street, though many believe her final stand occurred at Battlebridge Road in King's Cross, London. According to the ancient historian Tacitus, when Boudica rallied her men at Watling Street, she did so with even more panache than ever. As Boudica revealed her scars, she and her daughter circled the field in their chariot. They triumphantly declared, "On this spot, we must either conquer or die with glory. There is no alternative." Boudica was right, but not in the way she wanted. Celtic warriors were tall and muscular, standing at least a head above their Roman enemies. This alone would have made them look pretty imposing, but they also loved grandstanding. The Celts would often paint themselves a blue dye to look even scarier. As we'll see, the showboating didn't stop the Romans, but you've got to give the Celts points for style. If people were taking bets on Boudica versus the Romans, most people probably would have put their money on Boudica. After all, she had as many as 230,000 men fighting for her. The Romans, on the other hand, had just 10,000. With these odds, Watling Street should have been a slam dunk. However, Boudica's enemies had learned from her past victories, and now they had a clever plan to take her down. The Roman leader Paulinus was no fool. He specifically chose to fight at Watling Street because of its finicky layout. He arrived first, set up his men in a location that was nearly impossible to attack. With dense forests surrounding the Romans, Boudica would have no choice but to charge directly at her enemies. She would have no cover and no opportunity to sneak up on her foes. This had disastrous consequences. Boudica's fighting style wasn't very strategic. She basically showed up, burnt stuff down, and overwhelmed cities with a sheer number of her men. But this battle was different. As Boudica charged towards the Romans, they strategically threw sharp javelins at the Celts. Soon enough, Boudica became desperate to retreat, but getting out wasn't going to be easy. After so many victories, Boudica made the difficult decision to retreat, only to realize that she'd confined herself inside a death trap. You see, Boudica was so sure that she would win against the Romans that she invited her fighters' families to come watch the standoff. With relatives lining the outskirts of the field, Boudica and her men were trapped inside. In a tragic twist, the soldiers' own families spelled their doom. They traveled to Watling Street in bulky wagons that now stopped the forces from being able to leave a blood-soaked field. With the Celts trapped, the Romans took full advantage. They absolutely slaughtered Boudica's forces, felling approximately 80,000 of her people. The Romans defeated Boudica for a few key reasons. First, they chose the location and immediately gained the upper hand. Second, they'd made more powerful weapons. Third, and most importantly, their men received intensive training. They were quite literally raised to destroy enemies like Boudica. But even knowing all this, the final stat still hurt. Boudica lost 80,000 people. The Romans just 400. What makes Boudica's eventual defeat even more painful is just how frustratingly close she was to victory. If she had won at Watling Street, she would have changed the course of British history. The Romans would have gone back to Italy, leaving Britain to the Celts. In losing this one battle, Boudica also lost so much more. According to Tacitus, Boudica realized that she had no chance of winning the fight. As the Romans closed in on her, the warrior woman decided to take control of her fate. Instead of letting the Romans capture her, Boudica poisoned herself on the battlefield. It was a brutal way to go, but the Romans' play was so bloodthirsty that it made poison look like child's play. If the Romans treated Boudica the way they treated some of their other captives, then honestly, she was right for going with self-inflicted poison. If the Romans captured an enemy, they would march them through the streets and publicly execute them. Even after that, though, they wouldn't be done. They planned to display the bodies for all to see. If you believe the rumors, Queen Boudica's remains could be buried between platforms 9 and 10 at King's Cross Station in London. Or she might be underneath the McDonald's and King's Norton, Birmingham. No trace of her has ever been found, but archaeologists continue to look for the warrior queen to this day. One reason for her unending fascination with Boudica is her status as a first-class HBIC, but another is because Boudica's story didn't end with her demise. Far from it. When Boudica launched a rebellion, the Romans were basically caught with their pants down. But nobody can say they didn't learn anything about it. They swore that they'd never allow anything like Boudica's rebellion to happen again. That is going to bring us to the end of the video on Boudica. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like rating, subscribe for more, comment below, and FactNate will be back with a brand new video on a historical figure very soon.